You remember Jacob Rees-Mogg and his happy fish? Well, the country's fishing industry is suffering more than ever from Brexit. It was precisely the fishermen who had high hopes for leaving the EU. And now it turns out that it stole large amounts of fish, large sums of money, and many jobs. Veterans and industry chiefs have said their sector had been treated as the poster boy for Brexit and then sacrificed in the trade deal Boris Johnson agreed with the EU. And you will remember what Boris Johnson said in 2016 about this. We can take back control over UK waters, set our own fishing policies, and support our fishermen. Well, technically it can be argued that the UK now has control over its own waters and sets its own fishing policies. But it doesn't alter the fact that fish caught by UK boats is mainly exported to the EU, and the fish they eat is imported. According to research by the House of Commons Library, 60 to 80% of UK domestic landings are exported, and that includes fish popular on the continent like herring, mackerel, and shellfish. And meanwhile, cod, haddock, tuna, salmon, and prawns account for around 70% of all fish consumption in the UK and represent a significant proportion of their fish imports. With the UK now outside the common fisheries policy, all UK exports now have to have health certificates, catch certificates, and customs declarations. While the UK has increased its fishing quota share in talks with the EU, largely due to healthier fish stocks, by the way, and not through Brexit, the industry calculates that the added costs far outweigh the larger quotas, and it's therefore losing about £80 million a year because of Brexit. Add to that a shortage of labour, and it's difficult to argue that the industry is being supported. Because from the industry you hear sentences like, there is an issue with getting British people to work in processing factory where you have the smell of fish and it's 10 degrees. So much about their taking our jobs away. Fishing was a key plank of the 2016 campaign, with slogans claiming Britain would take back control of their waters and enjoy seas of opportunity. It led many fishermen, particularly small boat fishers, to back leave, with many detesting the EU system of quotas in its common fisheries policy. The terms of the agreement ex-PM Johnson struck with Brussels, however, did not transform the UK into the promised independent coastal state. Instead, significant EU access to British waters will remain until at least 2026, when the UK and Brussels will begin to negotiate fishing stocks annually. For example, John Clark, a skipper who voted for Brexit, said, "Many fishermen now feel like turkeys voting for Christmas. We don't have the best of both worlds," he said. "We don't have a sea of possibilities, it's just a hoax." If given a chance, Clark would vote differently. "It's not perfect, it has its flaws," he said of the EU. "But I think if we are still in the European Union, we wouldn't have any of that. We were promised we will take control of our waters, we will set our quotas. It was a total scam," he says. The Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Gove, whose father ran a fishing company in Scotland, held up the industry as Brexit raison d'être. A few days before the vote, Nigel Farage, well, you remember this prime mover of the effort to leave, led a flotilla of fishing boats displaying anti-EU banners up the River Thames, where he faced off against a flotilla of counter-protesters led by the aging rock star Bob Geldof. More than 9 in 10 fishermen intended to vote leave in June 2016, believing they were on the verge of taking back control of UK waters. The reality has proven somewhat more complex. The industry was in flux in January 21, the first month after the Brexit transition period ended. Facing new checks and paperwork, UK seafood exports to the EU and Britain's biggest trading market fell 83%. Processors continue to suffer labour shortages exacerbated by the pandemic and stricter immigration rules. Industry figures claim 15,000 tons of fish remained in the sea last year because of a lack of staff available to fillet it. Preliminary economic estimates by industry body Seafish shared with the media show the number of active fishing vessels and full-time equivalent fishing-related jobs fell 6% in 21 to 22 compared to 19 to 20, continuing a decade-long trend. In 21, the UK had 5,783 registered fishing vessels, and that's down 10%, and 11,000 fishermen, that's a reduction of 1,700 over the same period. Under the arrangement, EU nations with a coastline and a fishing industry treat fish as a common resource, with the European Commission setting the annual total allowable catch for each stock. And those permits are then distributed among member countries, which can exchange unwanted fish through a system known as quota swapping. During negotiations, British officials had set out a red line. EU vessels would be banned from operating within 6 to 12 nautical miles of the UK coastline. That prohibition failed to make it into the final pact agreed by Johnson. And indeed, under the terms of Johnson's agreement, British trawlers wouldn't receive an immediate and sizable rise in the amount of fish they could net in their own waters. Instead, the quota allocated to EU vessels would gradually reduce 25% over 5.5 years. In exchange, fishermen said they received an uptick in species they didn't actually covet, and only disappointing increases in key commercial fish like cod, anglerfish and saithe, which they did. In the eyes of the industry, Johnson was the second Conservative Prime Minister to shaft fishermen. First, it was Ted Heath, the 1970s leader, who took Britain into the European Economic Community and, as a result, the Common Fisheries Policy. And then came Johnson, promising the world and delivering, well, nothing. Fishermen in Northern Ireland, meanwhile, face a reality all of their own. Thanks to the region's unique relationship with the EU single market and the customs union, they can export without facing the same hurdles as mainland fishermen. However, they have seen issues bringing seafood to Northern Ireland from Great Britain under the post-Brexit protocol arrangements for moving goods between the UK internal market and the EU single market. Currently, it's the full implementation of the so-called Windsor Framework, that's the February 23 agreement between the UK and Brussels, to address issues around the original Northern Ireland Protocol that is of the most concern to the region's fishermen. If enforced, they fear the framework's Irish Sea customs border would treat them like arrivals from a foreign country when they return to Northern Ireland ports after fishing in local waters. And the reality is not yet clear there. Grace periods have so far prevented the framework's terms from being fully realized, and the UK insists it won't apply third country requirements, including checks and paperwork, on Northern Ireland fishermen. The UK's domestic market cannot compensate fishermen for the loss in EU trade. Britons have a strong penchant for cod, sold all around the country in its iconic fish and chip shops or stores, most of it imported from seas around Iceland, China and Norway. The UK's own more adventurous seafood is more in demand in restaurants across continental Europe. But as Brexit itself showed, trading arrangements are never set in stone. In 2026, the fisheries agreement between the UK and the EU is up for renegotiation. Britain is already considering its negotiating position, but banning EU vessels from operating within 6 to 12 nautical miles of the coast is not currently a red line, as a person familiar with the government's thinking told media. Were that to change, the EU, whose member countries want to maintain access to productive UK fishing grounds, would need plenty of notice, and it would have consequences. This person close to the government's thinking insisted the current approach, which allows Britain to set rules that EU boats must abide by in its waters, is pragmatic and sensible. The fleet can build capacity with help from a £100 million seafood fund, as this person argued, while still retaining access to the key European export market. And some now see Brexit opportunities. Industry figures are especially hopeful about legislation setting out how the UK plans to govern its territorial waters, through which it can manage stocks, distribute quotas and issue licenses for foreign vessels. A bill working its way through Parliament seeking to overturn legacy EU laws was kind of an opportunity to unwind stringent fishing rules. But still, few in the industry are holding their breath. Burned by two conservative prime ministers, top industry figures are lowering expectations ahead of the negotiations in 3 years' time. The industry fears Britain is effectively locked into the status quo. There's little appetite in London for radical unilateral action, which would surely trigger an equivalent response from Brussels. And that's what Brexiteers always like to forget. Yes, there's the renegotiation of the quotas from 26, the annual renegotiation. But it also means if the quotas go down unilaterally, if they just say we give you much less, access to the EU single market for the fish court would be very different. Because it's not we are holding all the cards. Well, yeah, we know. Gove said that while the rest of the world was playing chess. But it's always two sides of the bargain. And the one side has a gigantic market where you can sell the fish, and the other side has the fishing quotas. Do I have to say more? Nevertheless, if you are interested in Brexit and other topics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.